As the sun dips below the horizon, the dusty roads of northern Burkina Faso seem to hold their breath, caught in the tension of a nation on the brink. The air, thick with smoke and the smell of destruction, shrouds a war-torn land. In the distance, barely 50 meters away, stands a figure in the ruins of a once bustling checkpoint. It's Captain Ibrahim Traoré, his uniform torn and stained, his body weary from battle, but his eyes, focused and resolute, see more than just the enemy before him. He sees the future of a nation. Across from him, waiting with the quiet surrender of a man who knows his end is near, is Commander Amadu, a rebel leader whose name has haunted the villages of northern Burkina Faso. His men have left a trail of bloodshed, terrorizing families, burning homes, and shattering lives. Today, however, there are no weapons drawn, no soldiers at his side. Just two men, standing alone, facing a moment that will decide more than just one man's fate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stands at a crossroads. Will he take the vengeance that his soldiers crave? Or will he make a choice that will echo across the nation and history itself? This is not just a story of war. It is a story of justice, mercy, and the very soul of leadership in the face of unimaginable adversity. Stay with me as we delve into this extraordinary moment, where a single decision could either break a country or help it heal. Subscribe now for more stories of courage, strength, and true leadership from the heart of Africa. In the harsh reality of northern Burkina Faso, the year 2023 had arrived like a storm. The country was scarred, its villages burned to the ground, its people displaced, and its leaders trying desperately to hold together a nation on the brink of collapse. Ibrahim Traoré had been thrust into leadership just months earlier, after the previous government faltered in the face of mounting violence. What he inherited was a country broken in ways that could not be easily fixed. Rebel groups, including one led by the infamous Commander Amadu, controlled vast stretches of land, and the people suffered daily, their cries unheard beyond the borders of their homeland. As the captain of Burkina Faso's military, Ibrahim Traoré led his soldiers in a battle to take back what had been stolen by the rebels. The soldiers, exhausted but unwavering, fought with a purpose, each battle bringing them closer to reclaiming the land. But it wasn't just land they were fighting for, it was the heart and soul of a nation that was crumbling under the weight of its own history. The day Ibrahim Traoré's decision would come was not a day like any other. The dust of war had settled for a brief moment, and in that fleeting stillness, something happened that no one had prepared for. It started with a routine mission and intelligence report, suggesting Commander Amadu, the ruthless leader whose name was synonymous with fear, was hiding in a compound near the village of Djibo. Traoré's unit was briefed. Their orders were clear: surround the compound, capture Amadu, and end his reign of terror. The men moved swiftly, knowing the stakes. They approached the compound cautiously, their weapons drawn, their hearts heavy with the weight of the justice they were about to deliver. This was the moment. This was what they had trained for, what they had bled for. Amadu would finally face the consequences of his actions. The rebel commander, responsible for countless atrocities, would be captured and brought to justice. But as they breached the compound, something wasn't right. It was eerily quiet. The compound, once teeming with fighters, was nearly empty. The rebels had scattered into the surrounding bush. Only one man remained. Standing alone beside a burned-out vehicle was Commander Amadu. He was not running. He was not fighting. He wasn't even armed. His hands were by his sides, his face grim, a dust-covered mask of exhaustion and defeat. It was then that the soldiers of Traoré's unit closed in on him, their weapons aimed. The anticipation in the air was palpable, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. They had lost brothers, sons, fathers to the violence Amadu had perpetuated. They had seen the damage done burned villages, orphaned children, and bloodshed without end. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man they followed into battle, raised his hand to stop them. "Hold," he ordered. The soldiers froze, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. Why stop now? Why not just end this nightmare here, in this place with this man who had caused so much pain? But Traoré didn't move forward with his men's desire for immediate retribution. He stepped forward alone, boots crunching on the broken glass and debris scattered across the compound. The tension in the air was unbearable. Every soldier, every rebel, every civilian in the world seemed to hold their breath as the two men's enemies, now standing face to face, prepared to engage in a moment of decision. Amadu stood there, waiting. His posture had the quiet weight of someone who had long since accepted their fate, who knew there was no escaping what was coming. He said nothing. He didn't flinch as Traoré approached him, his eyes meeting the captain's with a strange mix of resignation and defiance. It was as if Amadu had already resigned himself to whatever was about to happen, and for the first time, there was no fury in his eyes, only the quiet emptiness of a man who had lost everything. "You know who I am," Amadu's voice broke the silence. Rough and raw, but devoid of the usual bravado. "I know exactly who you are," Traoré replied, his voice steady. Then came the question that none of the soldiers had prepared for. "Do you know what I have done?" Amadu asked, the words hanging in the air like a confession, or perhaps a challenge. Traoré nodded slowly. "I know exactly what you've done." There was no fear in his eyes, but there was something deeper, something that none of the soldiers behind him could fully understand. His jaw clenched, his body tense, but his mind was somewhere else. He had seen too much in his short time as a leader. He had seen the carnage, the death, the endless cycle of violence. And now, here was Amadu, standing before him, ready to face the consequences of his actions. But the question remained, what would Captain Ibrahim Traoré do now? The soldiers, their fingers still hovering on their triggers, waited. The silence stretched long. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on everyone. The man who had caused so much destruction stood before them, waiting to face justice. But what kind of justice would it be? Would it be the swift, brutal kind his soldiers wanted? Or would it be something else entirely? A justice that might break the cycle of violence, but also redefine leadership itself. The silence that enveloped the compound was suffocating. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood face to face with Commander Amadu, the man who had brought so much pain to the people of Burkina Faso. The soldiers behind him, his brothers in arms, were eager for justice, their fingers twitching on the triggers, ready to fulfill their duty. They had suffered too much, lost too many. The image of fallen comrades, the empty chairs in their barracks, the shattered families, they were all too vivid, too fresh in their minds. But Traoré stood still, his gaze fixed on Amadu, whose face was etched with a quiet kind of resignation. There was no fire in Amadu's eyes now, no malice. He was, for the first time, utterly a broken man who had seen and done things that had drained the very soul from him. He wasn't the monster they had all imagined. He was just a man, standing alone, waiting for his fate. "You expect mercy?" Traoré finally asked, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable hardness. Amadu shook his head slowly, the dust and blood on his face making him appear like a man who had already given up on redemption. "No. I expect justice. And I know what justice looks like for someone like me." The air grew thicker, and the tension among the soldiers behind Traoré was palpable. The soldiers had seen the horror that Amadu's men had inflicted on their land. Some had lost their families, their children, to this very man. Sergeant Ouedraogo, his face red with anger, stepped forward, his voice trembling with rage. "Captain, give the word." Ouedraogo's voice broke through the silence. "Let us end this now. He deserves nothing else." Other soldiers echoed his sentiment, their voices rising with agreement. "Justice means nothing if we don't do what's right here," one soldier said, his words sharp as his eyes glinted with unbridled fury. The shouts filled the air, a chorus of grief and anger, and in the center of it all, standing between his men and Amadu, was Traoré. His heart weighed heavy, torn between the cries of his soldiers and the nagging belief that revenge would never heal the wounds of the nation. He turned to face his men, his soldiers, his brothers. He could see the pain on their faces, the scars they carried from years of war, the brutal losses, the memories of their fallen comrades. All had led them to this moment. But now, he had to ask them one question, one that might challenge everything they had believed in. "I hear you," Traoré said, his voice rising above the noise. "I hear your pain, your anger, your grief. I feel it too." His eyes scanned the faces of his soldiers, each one a reflection of the nation's torment. "But if we execute him here, right now, what does that make us? What does it say about who we are, about the future we're fighting for?" For a moment, there was nothing but the sounds of the wind and the distant cries of the wounded. The soldiers looked at one another, unsure, confused. Were they warriors fighting for justice, or were they simply adding to the endless cycle of bloodshed? A voice from the back of the crowd spoke out. "He's a murderer, Captain. He deserves to die." The words were simple, direct, and everyone understood the anger behind them. They had seen too much. They had lost too much. How could they let him live? "Yes, he is," Traoré said, turning back to face Amadu. "And he should face justice. Real justice." The soldiers tensed, waiting for his next words, but Traoré took a deep breath before continuing, his voice now filled with quiet resolve. "If we kill him here, what do we become? What are we really fighting for?" Traoré's words hung in the air like a challenge to his men's very sense of self. Are we fighting to build a better Burkina Faso? Or are we just another faction of warriors, consumed by our need for revenge? The tension among the soldiers intensified. Sergeant Ouedraogo, who had been shaking with rage moments ago, stepped forward again, tears streaming down his face. His voice was a raw, broken thing. "You didn't see what I saw, Captain," Ouedraogo said, his words cracking. "You didn't hold my sister's body in your arms. You didn't see them. My family burned alive, slaughtered before my eyes. You don't understand. I'm asking you to take this anger from me. Please." The pain in Ouedraogo's voice hit Traoré like a physical blow. It was the same pain that ran through the veins of every soldier there. These men weren't just soldiers, they were victims of war, each one carrying the weight of unimaginable losses. And now, Traoré was asking them to let go of their grief, to set aside their anger for something that, to them, seemed impossible. For the first time, Traoré felt the full weight of his responsibility. This wasn't just about Commander Amadu. This was about his men, his soldiers, his brothers. He wasn't just deciding the fate of one man. He was deciding what kind of leader he would be. And he had to be better than the anger that had consumed so many before him. "I hear you," Traoré said softly, looking at Ouedraogo. "But what I want you to understand is that revenge is not justice. It's a cycle. We kill him, and we become him. We become the very thing we are fighting against." The silence in the compound was thick, suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. And in that stillness, something shifted. A crack in the wall of rage began to form. The soldiers weren't just seeing Amadu anymore. They were seeing themselves, seeing the choices they had to make, the kind of men they would become after the war. Traoré turned back to face Amadu, who stood silently, his eyes closed, as though awaiting whatever was to come. And then, with absolute clarity, Traoré spoke. "Commander Amadu, you will face justice," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "But not here. Not like this. You will be taken into custody. You will stand trial, and you will answer for the lives you have taken, for the families you have destroyed." The decision was made. But the repercussions were immediate and intense. The soldiers, who had hoped for the closure of immediate retribution, could not understand. Shouts of disbelief filled the compound. Some soldiers threw down their weapons, unable to accept the decision. Others turned away in anger, disgusted by what they saw as weakness. The air was thick with betrayal. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood firm. He had chosen the harder path, the one that would not give him immediate satisfaction, but the one that would echo through history. The road ahead would be uncertain. The future of Burkina Faso hung in the balance. But one thing was certain. The decision to choose justice over revenge would change everything. The decision was made. The air, once thick with tension, seemed to hang suspended in disbelief as Captain Ibrahim Traoré's order was given. Amadu, the man responsible for the suffering of so many, was not to be executed in this moment of fiery justice. Instead, he would be taken into custody, a prisoner to face trial. But the consequences of this decision were immediate, and the compound erupted into chaos. "What do you mean, a trial?" shouted Sergeant Ouedraogo, his voice raw, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. "He doesn't deserve a trial. He deserves death for what he's done. For my sister, for my family, for all of us." His words, laden with pain, reverberated through the soldiers around him. Others echoed his sentiment, their faces a mirror of rage, frustration, and loss. They had seen too much. They had buried too many comrades. How could they stand by as this manthus monster was granted the very justice they had fought for, the justice their fallen brothers would never get? The tension swelled to a fever pitch. The sound of shouts and heated words filled the compound, and for a moment, it seemed like everything was on the verge of breaking. The soldiers, who had followed Traoré into every battle, now found themselves divided. But Traoré's voice rang out above the noise, calm yet unwavering. "This is what I'm asking of you," he said, his words cutting through the storm of emotions. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm not asking you to forget what he's done. What I'm asking is this. What are we fighting for? Are we simply fighting to replace one tyrant with another? Or are we fighting to build a nation of justice, of laws, of hope? He turned to face his men, his expression fierce but full of conviction. We have to break this cycle. We cannot afford to be like him. If we execute him here, we become the very thing we are fighting against. Revenge is not justice. It's the darkness we've been trying to escape. For a moment, there was silence. The soldiers, worn and weary, stared at their captain, unsure whether to embrace the path of justice he had chosen or to turn their backs on him, unable to reconcile their pain with his decision. Sergeant Ouedraogo, his fists clenched, stood frozen, his tears tracing the deep lines of sorrow etched across his face. He was caught between his loyalty to his captain and the unbearable grief of his family's death. His heart torn between love for his fallen loved ones and the soldier's code of honor, struggled to find peace in this new order. "I can't do this, Captain," Ouedraogo said, his voice breaking. "I can't stand by and watch him live after everything he's taken from me." The room was still. Every eye was on Traoré, waiting. The soldiers who stood in support of him, the ones who had followed his every command without question, now felt a deep division. This was no longer just a military decision. It was a moral dilemma, one that reached into the very heart of what it meant to be a leader and what it meant to be human. Captain Traoré stepped toward Ouedraogo, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder. "I know," he said softly. "I know the pain you feel. But I ask you no. I beg you not to let this define you, not to let this rage be the end of us. We are better than this." For a long moment, Ouedraogo stood still, his eyes locked on Traoré's. And then, slowly, something shifted in him, a flicker of understanding. A shift from rage to exhaustion. His eyes welled with tears, but beneath them was something else. The faintest glimmer of hope, of possibility. The soldiers around them, those who had stayed silent, began to murmur among themselves. There was no easy answer, no quick solution. But in that moment, they saw something in their captain, a courage not of war, but of peace. It wasn't just about defeating Amadu. It was about choosing to rise above the hatred, to rise above the violence that had consumed their country for so long. As Traoré gave the order to take Amadu into custody, the atmosphere in the compound began to shift. The soldiers, though reluctant, began to move. The anger was still there, but it was joined by something else, something fragile, something that could grow if nurtured. A belief that perhaps, just perhaps, there could be a different path forward for their country, one that didn't involve the endless cycle of bloodshed they had known for far too long. But not everyone would stay. Some soldiers, unable to accept Traoré's decision, turned away. They walked out of the compound, abandoning their commander, unable to reconcile the ideals of justice with their thirst for retribution. As Amadu was escorted away, his hands bound and his head held low, the rest of the soldiers stood in silence, watching. It wasn't the victory they had imagined. It wasn't the justice they had hoped for. But it was a beginning, a difficult, painful beginning. And that, for some of them, was enough. The decision to imprison Amadu rather than execute him would spark a firestorm of reaction. The immediate aftermath would be filled with protests, with families of victims demanding justice, with soldiers questioning their captain's leadership. But in the weeks that followed, something unexpected would begin to unfold. The trial of Commander Amadu would become a symbol of something greater, a symbol of the possibility of redemption, of a future where even the darkest chapters could be rewritten. News of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's decision spread quickly, too quickly, it seemed. What had been an intense, life-changing moment for the soldiers on the ground became an international event, one that would test the resolve of the man who had made that difficult choice. The reaction to his decision was swift, and the country's future hung in the balance. From the very beginning, the international community was skeptical. Human rights organizations and foreign governments were quick to condemn Traoré's decision to spare Commander Amadu. They had expected a more typical response, a swift execution that would end the bloodshed and show the world that Burkina Faso was taking a strong stance against terrorism and violence. But instead, they saw something far more complex. To some, it appeared as if Traoré was weakening, unable or unwilling to do what was necessary to eliminate the threat that Amadu represented. Some questioned whether his actions would embolden other rebel groups, signaling that even the worst offenders could escape the punishment they deserved. Critics argued that such a decision might destabilize the country further, allowing Amadu's men to regroup and continue their reign of terror. In the media, headlines like "Mercy for Terror," "Burkina Faso's new leader chooses justice over revenge," and "Traoré's weakness will cost Burkina Faso" were widely circulated. International observers were quick to label Traoré's decision as naive and idealistic attempt at justice in a world where the harsh realities of war demanded something more decisive, more brutal. Within Burkina Faso itself, the reaction was far from uniform. The families of victims, those who had lost everything to Amadu's men, were outraged. Protests erupted outside military headquarters and government buildings with signs reading, "No mercy for murderers and justice for our loved ones." Mothers who had lost their children, fathers who had watched their families burn alive, all demanded that Traoré step down for failing to serve justice in its purest form. Some saw Traoré's decision as an act of betrayal. They could not comprehend why their leader, the man who had led them into battle, would allow the man who had caused them so much suffering to live. To them, justice was not a courtroom. It was the immediate retribution that came from the hands of those who had witnessed the atrocities firsthand. They had been fighting a war of survival, and to them the war was personal. But amidst the anger and outrage, something else began to stir a quieter reaction, a reflection on what Traoré had done. For the first time in years, there was a national debate on justice, mercy, and the kind of leadership the people wanted to follow. Would they follow a man who sought vengeance, or would they follow a leader who sought to break the endless cycle of violence? As the months passed, Traoré's decision began to be seen in a different light. The trial of Commander Amadu, which had seemed like an unlikely prospect just weeks before, became a pivotal moment in Burkina Faso's history. It was not just the trial of one man, but a moment for the nation to decide what kind of future they wanted. Could they move beyond the anger and hatred that had consumed them, or would they fall back into the same traps that had torn them apart? But the true test of Traoré's leadership was yet to come. The trial of Amadu was not the end, was just the beginning. The world watched as the trial unfolded, and the outcome of the case would set the tone for the country's future. Would the world stand with Burkina Faso's commitment to justice, or would they see it as a failure to act decisively? And more importantly, would the people of Burkina Faso be able to reconcile their pain with the path of justice Traoré had chosen? The world watched with bated breath as the trial of Commander Amadu unfolded. The rebel leader, once a symbol of terror, now sat in a courtroom where his victims could finally face him. Survivors of his brutal campaigns, mothers who had lost their children, fathers who had lost their families, came forward to tell their stories. their voices trembling with pain, yet strong in their pursuit of justice. For many, this trial was an opportunity for the truth to be heard. The atrocities committed by Amadu's men could no longer be swept under the rug or dismissed as casualties of war. Amadu had to answer for every life taken, every family destroyed. And as the testimonies piled up, something remarkable began to happen. The cycle of violence that had consumed Burkina Faso for so long began to shift. For the first time in years, the country was not just focused on revenge. It was focused on something far more difficult to achieve: real justice. As Amadu sat in the dock, facing the consequences of his actions, something remarkable happened within the ranks of Traoré's own soldiers. Sergeant Ouedraogo, the man who had been ready to execute Amadu on the spot, became one of the most vocal advocates for the new approach. He began speaking at community meetings about his journey from rage to something more complex. "I still carry the pain of what happened to my family," he would say, his voice thick with emotion. "That will never leave me. But I'm no longer consumed by it. I've seen that we can be strong and just at the same time. That's what my sister would have wanted. Not more death in her name, but a country worth living in." For Ouedraogo, and for many other soldiers, Traoré's decision had opened a new pathon that didn't require them to carry the weight of endless violence on their shoulders. The anger was still there, of course, but with it came the realization that they could be better than the hatred that had once consumed them. The ripple effects of this transformation went beyond the military. Within months, the first signs of peace began to emerge. Villages that had been under rebel control for years started to see the return of families. Children went back to school. The country, while still recovering from the horrors of war, began to heal in ways that seemed impossible before. But the most profound change was not just in the physical rebuilding of Burkina Faso, it was in the very soul of the nation. For the first time in years, people began to believe that something better was possible. They believed in the possibility of a justice system that could hold even the most powerful accountable. They believed that leadership, though born from hardship, could rise above the cycles of violence and show the world what true strength looked like. In the months that followed, the ripple effect of Traoré's decision reached beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The international community, which had initially criticized his decision as weak, began to shift its perspective. Burkina Faso was no longer seen as just another war-torn nation fighting a never-ending battle. Instead, it became a symbol of hope, a nation willing to break the cycle of violence and rebuild through justice. Other countries in Africa, many of which had been caught in similar cycles of conflict and revenge, began to look at Traoré's leadership as a model. Here was a man who, instead of allowing the violence to consume him, chose to rise above it. He chose to be a leader not just in war, but in peace. His leadership, though born from the ashes of conflict, had begun to build something far more powerful than an army. It was building a future. But the road ahead was far from easy. The challenges were many: corruption, economic struggles, the scars of war that would take generations to heal. The trial of Amadu, though historic, was just one step in a much longer journey. And as Captain Ibrahim Traoré, now a general, stood at the polls for the first free and fair elections in Burkina Faso in over a decade, he was reminded of the weight of the decision he had made that day in the compound. The stakes were still high. The future of Burkina Faso still hung in the balance. As he cast his ballot, a reporter approached, asking a question that had haunted the country. "Do you ever regret your decision that day, General? What if the system had failed? What if Amadu escaped justice?" Traoré paused for a moment, his gaze steady. And then, with a quiet smile, he answered. "Every day," he said, his voice filled with both conviction and humility. "And never. It was the hardest choice I've ever made, but it was the right one. Because it proved something that everyone had stopped believing. That we could be better than our worst impulses. That justice could mean something real. And that even in the darkest moments, humanity could prevail." Burkina Faso's first fully democratic elections in 5 years were a testament to the strength of its people and to the enduring legacy of one man's decision to choose justice over revenge. General Ibrahim Traoré's story would never be forgotten. His decision to spare Commander Amadu, despite the fury and pain of his soldiers, had changed the course of history. Not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's decision to spare Commander Amadu is not just a tale of war, but a profound lesson on leadership, justice, and mercy. It is a story of a leader who, despite the immense pain of his soldiers and the pressure of his people, chose the harder path, a path of justice, one that transcends the immediate thirst for revenge. In doing so, Traoré reminded us all that true strength lies not in how hard we strike, but in knowing when not to. For a nation torn apart by war, where the very essence of humanity had been tested, Traoré's choice was a bold declaration that even in the darkest times, we can still choose to be better than our enemies. This was the test of his leadership not in the battlefield, but in the heart of his people. What followed the trial of Amadu, the slow but steady rebuilding of the nation, the spark of hope in the heart of a broken peoples, was the result of that single, difficult decision. It was the beginning of a new Burkina Faso, one that chose to fight not just with weapons, but with principles. And what about the man, Commander Amadu, who had once been feared by so many? He spent the rest of his life in prison, but his actions, however limited, carried a weight that extended beyond his own punishment. In an unexpected twist, Amadu even requested to speak to former child soldiers, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. "I convinced myself that violence was the only answer," he said, "but look where it led me. I destroyed countless lives, including my own. Don't follow my path. There is another way." Amadu's words reached those who might have followed his example, inspiring them to seek a different pathone that did not rely on violence, one that was rooted in the possibility of peace. The trial of Amadu and the courage of Ibrahim Traoré became a symbol that rippled far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. It wasn't just about one man's redemption. It was about a nation finding its humanity again, and a people finally believing in the possibility of a future free from the cycle of vengeance and bloodshed. What would you have done in Ibrahim Traoré's position? Would you have taken the same path? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, true strength isn't about how hard you can strike, but about knowing when not to. If you were inspired by this story, subscribe for more powerful stories of leadership and compassion. Share this video to inspire others with the power of justice and mercy. Thank you for watching.